Hello, welcome to an episode of In Conversations at Azim Premji University. My name is Amit Basole. I am a faculty in economics at the university. Today we have a very special guest with us, Professor Sonalde Desai from the National Council for Applied Economic Research and the University of Maryland. Professor Desai is here in town to be a part of the Advanced Graduate Workshop, which is a workshop that we have been running here at the university in collaboration with the Institute for New Economic Thinking for many years now. It's an opportunity for PhD students in economics and in allied fields to come together, be a part of a community for 2 weeks where they get exposed to each other's work as well as to cutting edge research, which scholars come in from various parts of India and the world to present. And Professor Desai is here as part of that. Today, I'm going to be talking to her about the India Human Development Survey, which many of you might be familiar with, of which she has been a part, indeed a leading part from the earliest round in 2005. And the third round has just been completed recently. So Professor Desai has been conducting these surveys, analyzing them, writing about them for almost 20 years now. Welcome, Professor Desai.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let me start by maybe you talking a little bit about the overall significance of the India Human Development Survey. I myself have used it as a researcher. I know many people who use it, and indeed people are waiting eagerly for the third round data. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But tell us a little bit about the big picture, how it started, what your ideas were when you started, and so on.
It started as a very small thing, actually. I was on a sabbatical from University of Maryland at NCAER. And I was talking to my colleagues and complaining that in India we have economic data, we have demographic data, but we don't have a data set which allows us to study sort of social interactions of various type and understand overlap between society, economy, population studies, and so on. And my colleague said, okay, but why don't you collect the data? Okay. And I said, I have never done data collection. I don't know how I would do it. And the answer was, we'll help you. So that's how we got started. Okay. Got started because it felt like there were areas that I wanted to study, that other people wanted to study, for which there was no appropriate data.
Interesting. And I should say, if people who are watching who have not actually looked at the data or publication based on it, then it is indeed a very multidimensional data set. It has not only the usual kinds of living standards and things like that, or employment, etc., consumption and income, but also education, health, various dimensions are there. So my impression as a researcher who has used it and talked to people is that it has been, to use an overused term, a game changer in the Indian data ecosystem, not only because of the multidimensional kinds of things that we just spoke about, but also importantly, it is a panel. Right? So you did the first round in 2005, but then the 2011 was a follow-up and you visited the same households again. Maybe you can say a little bit for the general viewership on the importance of a panel data set.
Yes, a lot of things that we think about is we want to track changes in Indian society. And the way typically changes get tracked is comparing data sets over time. But unless we compare the same households, we cannot know whether any given household has changed and what led to these changes. So our goal was to look at the same households, the same individuals, and see how their lives are evolving and to track those lives rather than sort of general conditions of the society.
And was it always an idea to do a follow-up when you first did?
We always intended to do it, or at least we always hoped we would do it, because what that also requires is to collect consent from individuals to be recontacted and their address and location information, which we collected with the intention of going back to them.
Right. When the first round came out, was there something about its reception, how it was received, how it was used that either encouraged you to, it's worth doing a second round, or were there some unexpected things that you found?
It was very interesting. When we started collecting this data, it was because we were interested in it as a researchers, right? Part of our agreement with our funding agencies was to put it out in public domain, right? And I didn't realize how much interest there would be from other people in using that data. Okay, which really encouraged us. It made it easier for us to continue this work, easier to get more funding, but also just gives you a strength. You realize that there are so many people who are interested in this data, and that sort of makes all the effort that we put in worthwhile.
Right. That's very interesting that, you were already had an independent research agenda at the time and you're an established researcher and it was your need that made you do it. But then what you created as a result of that need is actually much bigger now, right? And used by a very large number of people.
The user community today is, there have been more than 12,000 downloads. There have been more than 1,200 journal articles, dissertations, etc. So it feels good to know that, there is this resource which now is so valuable. I think we also got very lucky that this data got collected at a time when India was undergoing so many changes, right? So new policies were being put in place, which people wanted to understand. Households were changing over time. So that also helped.
Right. And we'll come to, some of the insights that you have, early insights, let's say, about the changes that have occurred. But one last point just on the rounds of the survey. So the first round was in 2005, second in 2011, and now the third round has just been completed. This time period between the second and the third, did you want to do it earlier? How did it end up?
Yes, we did. Ideally, we would have liked to do it after 5 years. By the time we got everything organized, funding organized, etc., it was 7 years. But then the COVID struck, right? And which basically held up everything. So returning to it took us some time. Ideally, panel data, it would be very good to have it every 5 years. Okay, and we are going to end up doing it in 10 years. So there is somewhat of a longer gap. On the other hand, we have never really intended to do the kind of surveys that are done which provide you month-to-month, year-to-year changes. Our intention was always to look at changes over a long duration in households' lifestyle and looking at intergenerational transmission of various characteristics. So a long period is pretty good from that perspective.
Right. Absolutely. And I think the kind of period we are talking about of these 20 years is a very interesting one in India. Before we get into those changes, a little bit on the, let's say, the day-to-day of conducting a large national survey. This is a nationally representative survey. It has a sample of 50,000 households all over the country and so on. So it's an enormous exercise to undertake. Can you say a little bit about, stories that I'm sure you have countless stories, funny anecdotes, incidents, and so on. Whatever comes to mind, running this.
It's very interesting. So you're collecting data for India as a whole, right? And there is such geographic and cultural diversity in India about just all kinds of social practices, lifestyles, even public policies. So one of the issues that came to us was we wanted to collect data on marriage practices. And marriages, in some areas, they are within cross-cousin marriages within the same family. In some areas, it would be incestuous, right? So the question is, how do we ask the designer questionnaire that can be used in Haryana and can be used in Tamil Nadu? Okay, so one of the questions we really wanted to ask was whether there was any relationship between the husband and wife that was sort of, cross cousins, uncle, niece, whatever. And we knew that our interviewers, if they tried to ask this question in Haryana, they would be beaten up and run away, right? So one of the things we had to do was to preface it by saying, look, we are doing this survey all over India. Different parts of India have different practices. In some places, it's okay to marry your cousin, marry within the village. What's the practice in your village? Okay. And if they said that the cross-cousin marriages are allowed, then we would move to the next step. Otherwise, we would skip that particular question. So now you're designing something that is culturally acceptable. Okay. and yet sort of covers the nation as a whole. Okay, it was a very interesting exercise.
Right. And again, going back to, how many different kinds of things the survey collects information on, these kinds of things, marital practices, other social norms, gender norms, caste norms, all of these things. In fact, IHDS has been one of the few sources where you can find that with, let's say income or consumption and so on.
That was the interesting part of it. We had a clarity on the questions to ask when it came to income, consumption, schooling. Okay, when it came to these other things, we didn't know. Okay, so for example, we wanted to assess the quality of education. We didn't know how to do it. So I actually went and talked to a lot of people in educational practices. And I ultimately ended up talking to Rukmini Banerjee, who was an old friend. And I said, Rukmini, how do we assess people's learning outcomes? She actually very kindly shared the ASER questionnaire, and we implemented it before the first ASER came into being.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that.
And we have been repeating it regularly. Okay? So I think it's also been that in some sense, the work has benefited tremendously from inputs of friends, well-wishers, and we have sort of borrowed from people where it made sense. Okay, and it's been great, actually.
And, talking about the diversity you were mentioning, of course, language is a big one. And when you talk about a survey, we're talking about a conversation, which has to happen in that language. Now, I think people will, of course, appreciate that states have different languages. But within a state also, we know, those who have done fieldwork know that different parts of Rajasthan have very different language and so on. How do you, concretely, are these teams very local? How do you do these things?
That's a really interesting question, okay? Because we translate the questionnaire in 10 languages, okay? But Hindi in Bhojpuri from Awadhi to Bridge is very different. Right. So one of the things, and this is where we found ourselves diverging from the standard survey practices in the West. In the Western sort of lexicon, you have to have exactly worded questionnaires. Every interviewer is supposed to read it out exactly as worded so that there is no between interviewer variation. Okay. Instead, what we found was that if we tried to do that, our respondents simply wouldn't understand what is being asked. So what we did was we tried to, first of all, find interviewers who were reasonably familiar with the region. Second, we tried to explain the questionnaire very carefully to them and expected that they would, in some sense, present it to the respondent in a locally understandable way.
Right.
So rather than reading out questionnaire verbatim, it was much more of what is now come to known as a conversational interview.
Right.
And we found that to be a very useful way of doing it. It does require, however, that you train your interviewers very well. Okay? And we end up with a fairly long training period. We started out by doing a 13-day training, which is now extended to 21-day training for each interviewer. Because we are dealing with different languages in India, we have ultimately ended up doing about 19 trainings. And we require that the training be done by the same trainers. So the NCAER has a core team of trainers who would go to various places and do the training. So there were times when people didn't have time to even do their laundry before finishing up in Andhra and going over to Kerala.
And you yourself have been part of many of these.
I have. And I learned a lot out of it.
Yeah, and survey training is, again, people who haven't done it perhaps would not appreciate what a critical part of the survey it is. The survey lives and dies by how well the enumerator understands what you're, not the researcher or not the designer of the questionnaire. Which brings me to, a kind of follow-up question on gathering information that we know is not easy to gather. Some things are easy to find, maybe do you own a fridge or not, or do you own a two-wheeler or not, or something like that. But then when we move into consumption, and even more when we move into income, I remember first looking at the IHDS income data many years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and I was really impressed by how much thought had gone into the income module. Because in a country like India, unlike the West, most people are not wage earners.
Exactly.
You can just quickly ask a question and move on. So you have to recover the business income or the self-employment income. There's a lot of thought that goes into that. And then there are questions to do with, let's say, women's work or other things, that we know traditionally surveys have had trouble gathering information on. So perhaps say a little bit about how IHDS has dealt with these.
Yeah, this was interesting. See, I don't come from a farming background, and I don't understand always all the inputs and outputs that go into the farm. Okay, so when we started designing the questionnaire, I really lucked out. Okay, that I had somebody working with me who had a very deep farming background, and NCER does a lot of agricultural studies. So there were sort of models that we could use on that he had ideas about, and very strongly felt about how do you collect this information. Okay. So we used to have these long debates about things that didn't, like I had never heard of intercropping. Okay, but how do you collect data on intercropping?
Right.
So I was very fortunate that we had an interdisciplinary, very experienced team. We worked very closely together and to build some of these questionnaires. We took from other questionnaires where it made sense. At one point in time, my colleague and I taught actually a course at University of Maryland on questionnaire design. And the idea was that each of the students would design one module of questionnaire, and they would review all the other surveys. They would create a sort of a paper from which we would draw. Okay, so we worked pretty hard. We had a lot of fun with it. We pre-tested things. At some point in time, we thought, oh, we have a perfect questionnaire. We go there, and what should have taken half an hour is actually taking an hour. Okay, so we go back and we start on the cutting boards, cut out some things, go back. Oh, we have now cut too much. So there was a lot of iterative processing, and that was a lot of learning and fun. Some of the issues that I think we have had to deal with are also making choices in a way where the data are being collected that you decide, that there are going to be some issues. Okay, so take for example the household structure. Okay, you collect data on who lives in the household with a household roster. Okay. At one point in time, I was doing some pre-testing, and I'm going through collecting data, who lives in this household, how many children, etc., etc. Collected the roster data, and then started asking the woman about her fertility history. And then she's missing out this one child. Okay? I said, but where is Sangeeta in this fertility history? And the answer is, oh, she's not my daughter. She's my brother-in-law's daughter. She lives next door, but she's like my daughter only. Okay. Now what do I do? Okay. I have a roster that has been collected. I recognize that this child is not a part of it. And so we sort of strike it out with a pencil, saying that, okay, she shouldn't be included, which worked perfectly fine with a paper and pencil.
Right.
Now you go into a computerized data collection where you have to start locking up things because the information from one page gets pre-populated into the subsequent pages. Right? So we actually decided that we have to lock the roster, but we allowed for at the end a possibility for somebody to say that, okay, this person is now in the household roster but shouldn't have been there. So the complications are not just, it's sort of like we are dealing with a culture, we are dealing with concepts of who belongs to a household and how we collect that data. Then we are dealing with the mechanics of data collection. Okay, most of us were not trained in how to do the data collection, right? So you're learning on the job. Okay, a lot of fun, but a lot of work too.
Yeah, this is very fascinating, and this is perhaps a technical point, but the move from paper to computer, tablets and so on, which is now almost universal. All the national sample surveys also being done in this way. That has fundamentally changed how things happen, because there is a conversational style, there is a ability to go back and correct things in paper, which when you go screen by screen is just much harder to do. The other thing is that you can implement, let's say, bounds and caps and checks inside, which is good because it can reduce noise, but then also it reduces the flexibility of the enumerator to write down things, right?
Exactly.
It is sort of binding them to certain preconceived things that have been put in. So you have experienced, of course, both paper and tablet, because it must have started as a paper
A paper
survey.
sent.
In 2011, was it still a paper survey?
It was still a paper.
So this is the first time you've done a tablet.
This is the first time we have done it computerized.
Any big lessons that came out of it?
So we had to learn that the way you ask the questions changes drastically. Okay? It's not just that your data is going to be collected in computer and it will be coming to you faster, but it's the way you word your questions, the way you give up options, etc. changes quite a lot. Okay? And we had to learn to figure out how to handle some of these changes. It took away some flexibility, it added some other flexibility. Okay. So, for example, previously we used to have an interviewer manual, which our interviewer would carry around. If they got confused, they would look up at the manual. Now, because there was no, and what would happen is that you couldn't get a very big questionnaire because your interviewers were carrying this huge bundle with them, right? And there is only so much they can carry. So, we would try to shorten the questionnaire in terms of paper length, but we also needed to give them instructions on what to do. Now, with the computer, the screen shows all the instructions, it shows the questions, which all helps. Okay, we tried very hard to bring in back some of the paper flexibility of allowing them to write notes. Okay, so that we have tried. However, again, to look through it makes a bit of a problem. Some of the other things that were possible is the kind of quality control that is possible with paper and with computers is a different one. With paper, what would happen is that we would have monitors who would go into the field. They would take the questionnaire from the interviewer and sort of thumb through it and see what's being done and sort of cross-check with the households that were being interviewed. Now the data is on computer and it gets uploaded, so it's very difficult to sort of thumb through and cross-check. On the other hand, in our office in Delhi, we actually have some of the audio recordings of the interview which we could hear. We could look at some of the data which says, okay, some interviewer is constantly rushing through the questionnaires. Then we figure out whether they are not understanding things and they're making mistakes or they're deliberately rushing through. So the quality control is of different nature.
Right, right. I want to just get your opinion, on, we often get into a debate on survey data versus administrative data, right? Which is better and so on. And of course, you have seen both worlds, but survey you have deep knowledge of. What would you say are the strengths today in India of continuing with these kinds of sample survey approaches?
Administrative data are very useful when you are trying to look at the reach of particular programs. Okay, but if you want to see who got left out of that program, okay, then you have no choice but to talk to people through surveys. Okay, so people who are people like me who really care about the poverty, the people who are excluded, for us, survey data still remain the sort of golden in some sense.
And that perfectly, brings me to the latest survey round and what you have found. You have found there's been some coverage of this in the papers, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the big lessons over the long run. What have you seen change in these 20 years, poverty-wise, living standards, household structures?
It's very clear that India has experienced economic growth and that poverty has declined, and it's declined over pretty much all throughout the 21st century. What we don't fully understand is that along with the poverty decline, the dynamics of the poverty has also changed. Okay? People who used to be poor get out of poverty because of the economic growth, but then people who manage to get out of the poverty are living in this very uneasy situation where they could get very easily pushed back into poverty if there is a death, illness, pandemic, something happens. Okay? So trying to understand this dynamics of poverty makes you realize that as economy grows, we are going to have to look at not just who is poor and who is not, but who is in a situation which is vulnerable enough to push them back into poverty, and how do we create social safety nets to support these people.
Right. I think and this is where the panel part of the data is essential, because you're observing the same household over 20 years. And you can see what has happened. Right. Any other lessons that you care to share on any aspect of measurements that you have done?
We find that there is also some very interesting changes that are happening as a intergenerational dynamics. Okay, where when we began data collection, the preference for sons was very high, which has been very well known in India. Fertility was high, and as we were collecting the data, fertility started dropping. Okay, families started getting smaller. And what we start seeing is that there is this transformation in how children are viewed by the family. Okay, parents have relied on their children; they will continue to rely on their children. But there is this whole transition where aspirations are growing. There is a desire to invest in one's children. So increasingly, we start seeing these families which have one child, two children. Sometimes that one child is only a daughter. Okay, and yet people stop. Okay, they invest disproportionately into educating these children. Spend a large chunk of their income into sending children to private school. So we are seeing this very interesting transformation. The question is that how is this transformation going to play out going forward? Because as these adults become older age, they will have only one child or two children. They would have migrated. Okay, how are they going to be supporting themselves and caring for themselves as they get older? So what we find is that we see some of these interesting trends emerging. It gives rise to some very interesting policy questions, and I can't wait for the next installment to figure out, how things are going to look.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you very much. And of course, we look forward to these reports and papers and data coming out and the future work as well. And thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for participation in this great workshop. Thank you.